Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. It is April 18th, 2016. It's interesting because this webinar was scheduled to air a few weeks ago, and just prior to its airing, to its production, I had experienced a significant amount of grief and loss for myself. And my process around that was I wanted to be there for you all. I don't like canceling webinars. And then I had to come to terms with the fact that I needed to take care of myself. And that really does start off with the crux of grief and loss. When I talk about grief and loss, I'm talking about all kinds of grief and loss. And the first and most paramount issue to be aware of is that everybody has at times conflicting needs. And so for families, that's difficult. In the case of spouses who have lost a child or a family member, that can be very difficult for them to support each other because you go through grief in different ways. Even when we talk about the grief of having your child away in a program like many of you have right now or have had, of course, in the recent past, it's an opportunity to recognize that you can't meet everybody else's needs in the family, that you're so depleted by your own grief and loss, and because you're going through it in a different way, that it's important to access resources outside of the family to be able to take care of yourself. So give yourself permission to recognize that you can't fulfill the other person's needs in all the ways that they need you to. And so they and you will have to go for outside resources. So I just want to share that from a personal perspective. It's been said that grief and loss is the most pure and fundamental issue and work in therapy. And I think what we mean by that is that it's this process of learning how to feel, learning how to move through something. Right? That's the foundational idea of therapy, is learning to recognize that symptoms are feelings coming out sideways. And when there is significant grief or loss or trauma in our lives, learning how to feel it and go through it is kind of a fundamental way of looking at therapy. You're going to have a lot of emotions. Not everybody in families are going to agree about their emotions. And when you try to talk the other person into your version, and I just had a phone call with a family today where they were going through that process. Somebody was more optimistic, somebody was more pessimistic, somebody was more sad, somebody was more hopeful. And it was difficult for them to sit with each other's emotions. In fact, they would oftentimes tell each other how to feel. You should look at it this way. You should be feeling that. And what happens for us is we also think that we should be feeling something. Right? We have this idea about what it should feel like. Or maybe even what should be happening. And we pay so much attention to that. We're at battle with ourselves and our grief, that we can't really acknowledge that we just need to move through it, that there's genuine grief and loss. Of course, you can develop some physical symptoms around it, headaches, stomach problems, digestion problems. Those are very, very common. And so it's important to again, move through that process so they don't come out sideways, so they don't leak, psychologically speaking, out in some other way. And those physical symptoms can be real. It's not that they're not real symptoms, that they're not real health issues, because they are. I think sometimes when we think about somatic symptoms, that is physical symptoms that are manifestation of an emotion, we think that it's faking it, and it's not. You can be really sick if you don't learn to process these emotions. I remember early in my marriage, my wife was going through a significant grief experience in her life, and we ended up in the emergency room because she was having digestive problems. So that can be a very big challenge, very real challenge for people in their lives. And not recognizing it can lead to that kind of manifestation. I think another way that's difficult for people is cognition. It's probably the biggest challenge when people are talking to and interacting with people that are experiencing grief, is they try to give them look on the bright side thoughts, right? Optimistic thoughts. Try to give them their idea of what might be helpful to them. Try to challenge sometimes the really dark and difficult thoughts that people have when they're going through a grieving process. And again, like a lot of what we talk about, people are allowed to grieve in their own ways. And when they're told to do it a different way or to think a different thought, it can lead to more problems and absolutely lead to a sense of loneliness. I talk about it in the first chapter of my book, first couple of chapters of my book, where I talk about Adam, who's going through the grief process around his mother. And it was a crystallizing moment for me where I recognized I didn't have a look on the bright side speech. I didn't have a look at it this way. And that while we send your children while you send your children to us to learn how to feel, it can become incredibly tempting to try to make them feel comfortable instead of feel the pain that they need to feel, that's connected to the love that they feel and that is a part of the loss. And you can't have one without the other. Right? You can't have an experience of love without the risk of grief and loss in a process. And of course, behaviors are an important part. You know, you've heard that idea that the people that need our love and support the most ask for it at times in the worst ways. And the things that we do to protect ourselves from pain hurt other people. And that our reaction as parents, as professionals sometimes, to our adolescents and young adults can be anger or frustration or impatience. And all we're doing on a psychological level is responding to the symptom, if you will, that is connected to their pain, to their sadness, to a lot of other feelings also. And the interpretation of the person on the receiving end of that is that something's wrong with me. And it does something fantastic. The behaviors, the acting out symptoms, and I'm going to talk about some of those tonight, the acting out symptoms of our unexpressed and unexperienced grief are, in a way, a red herring. If we can get people focused on our behaviors, focused on our drug use, focused on our cutting, focused on our skipping school, if we can get people to focus on that, then the symptoms themselves serve to provide a smoke screen for everybody and us to not feel and deal with it. That's why I talk so much about learning to develop the capacity to see and hear the wound beneath the symptoms. Because if we don't do that and we attend to the behaviors, then we're actually responding in the way that the symptoms are hoping that we do, which is we get off track. We miss it. I was talking to a family recently that was doing a very good job of that, where the child kept wanting to talk about substance abuse and the cessation of it, and the fact that he didn't want to do it anymore and he was over it. And the parents did a very good job saying, we're not going to talk about that. That's not what this is about. We want to figure out what you were medicating, what was going on for you. If we can talk about that, then we're really getting at the root of the problem. And that's a perfect example. And so when you get interested in a conversation around symptom cessation or continuing a symptom, you're off track. You're talking about the wrong thing. There's a very famous model that Kubler-Ross talks about in the stages of grief. And she talks about this idea of going through denial to anger to bargaining to depression and acceptance. And we know, and we've known this for years, shortly after this model was presented, that not everybody goes through it in the same order with the same amount of time, and you can go back and forth in these different areas. But another way to think about it, these are common responses to grief. You can recognize these at times in your own process around having your child at Evoke. And you can also recognize that in the letters and the phone calls that you receive from your child as they go through a grief and a loss process. And all of those losses, the losses of friends, the ones that even you think, or the ones that you even think aren't positive influences on your child, that's still a real loss. They still had an experience with that person that was rewarding. I even remember when I was 16 going through my own treatment as a teenager, and my mother finally drew the line that substance use wasn't going to be allowed in the home. And I started to believe her because I was sitting in a hospital in Huntington Beach, California. And I remember my reaction, and the therapist said, it's like you just lost one of your friends, isn't it? She said, one of your best friends, isn't it? And I acknowledged that. I thought, it is. And again, most people would be tempted to talk their child out of that. That's not a real friend. They're not reliable. But everybody gets to decide about their own grief. We don't get to tell people about what they should be grieving about and how they should be doing it. So recognizing and having some flexibility with others and with yourself around how you go about this. The diagnostic manual talks about uncomplicated bereavement is considered present when an individual is able to move through the stages of grief and come to some resolution. And again, we want to be careful because we don't want to suggest that there's an absolute correct time frame. You know, part of this is decided on by the individual that is in it. They might feel stuck, but it's a lot of times people get impatient with their own grief process. but the idea is moving through it and feeling it. The phrase that I resonate with when it comes to feeling the loss is this idea of Joseph Campbell when he said, if you're falling, dive. You know, that idea of leaning into it. And also to understand, I think there's a beautiful story in the movie Shadowlands with Anthony Hopkins. And it's the story of C.S. Lewis's life based on real events in his life. And just before his wife was to die, and they were at this beautiful place, and she started to talk about when she was gone. He said, no, I don't want to talk about that right now. I just want to focus on that we have each other right now. And she said, you don't get to do that. You don't get to carve out the pain and the hurt. Because if you carve that out, essentially she was teaching him, then you carve out the love that we have right now. And so it's inevitable. It's an inevitable part of loving and being in a relationship. Unresolved grief, of course, can lead to clinical depression. I want you to think about depression as a pressing down of one's truth, one's reality, parts of oneself. And so what a lot of people like to do, if you can imagine a lake, a reservoir, and a river. And what people want to do is they want to block the negative, unhappy, unpleasant feelings. It's almost as if they could create a dam that would just hold back the unwanted stuff. But as we know, if you dam up a lake or a river, all of it gets held back. And so that depression, that lack of feeling, that numbness, that darkness that one experiences can in essence be the repression of authentic suffering. That is why the most common way out of depression is learning to feel things that we're afraid of, that we think will overwhelm us and destroy us, that we think are going to be unwanted and unwelcomed by others because they seem to be overwhelmed by them. So it's important that we understand that depression is a solution psychologically, unconsciously, of course, in many ways, for us to deal with grief, to deal with loss. Of course, anxiety can be a part of it. Anxiety is all about trying to control it, right? And manage it and believe that we have to be strong and tight and just hold on to it. We can't let it overwhelm us, right? That's why the best response to somebody who suffers from panic attacks is to ask them to have it. Because the panic attack, which is the most exaggerated, severe form of anxiety, is the attempt to control it. And if you try to have it, you can't have it. So learning to move through it, learning to have it be something that flows with you instead of something you try to manage is important. And there's a fantastic surrender. Surrender is the opposite of the instinct of the person who's anxious, right? Cutting, right? Feel something. I'd rather feel the pain of the cutting, or I'm so numb that I want to feel something. Self-harm can be unresolved grief. Substance abuse, of course, is classic. Substance abuse is the physical, outward type of solution. Depression is kind of the psychological inward. So if I can medicate myself, numb myself out, get myself into a different reality, I can get rid of those unwanted feelings that I'm having. And then, of course, oppositional defiant behaviors. And I think it's important for all of us to acknowledge that it's important that we learn to hear those kinds of behaviors, right? And not just look at them two-dimensionally. And definitely, like I say in the behavioral chapter of the book, take some time to pay attention and see if we can discover what the behaviors could teach us and tell us before we launch into trying to change them. That's critically important. We start to then value the struggle and instead of want it to just go away. And when we learn to surrender to the process, when we learn to stop fighting with ourselves about what is, about what has happened, and about the ways that we're responding to it, we also then get access to all the wisdom, all the treasures, all the beauty that painful experience has to teach us. And we start to develop a different relationship with our grief and loss. We start to connect it to our love. It starts to have some more greater meaning. Like Viktor Frankl talks about in Man's Search for Meaning, one of the greatest ways to ensure that you're not going to be happy is to always seek after it. He suggested instead that we search to give meaning to our suffering. And when we do that, it becomes something different. And I think that's part of what I talk about when I talk about that when we can feel our pain, our grief, and our loss, that we can recognize that it's connected to a whole bunch of stuff that we want to keep. And we can honor it. I think that a lot of people are looking for, I had somebody tell me recently they wanted to just give me a pill so I can be there. Just give me the answer. And I think it's more of a process that you just go through. There are no shortcuts. I'll talk about that later with a graphic. There are no shortcuts or ways around or above it. We just move through it. Wilderness provides you that opportunity to get in touch with it, to become friends with it, to touch it, to sit with it, and ultimately learn that we can heal through that process, that going through it is a part of the healing. It's a time to reflect, a time to think, a time to feel. We really do remove so many of the natural distractions that we have in life. I have a friend who was talking about a joke yesterday that he went on an elevator and just for fun he decided to not look at his phone and revisit the old awkward moments that we all felt on elevators before we had our phone. Or I was talking to another friend who says, I don't mind going out to dinner alone. I used to, but now I just bring my iPad so I don't have to sit with myself. Or Louis C.K. says that we're so uncomfortable with ourselves. Do you ever find yourself just texting people randomly and saying, hey, what's up? Because if we have to spend just 2 minutes by ourselves with ourselves, we can be uncomfortable. And wilderness is the exaggeration of that, spending time with yourself and seeing how you like the company. Somebody calls it quietude, which is this noble silence, right? It's more than just no sound. But there's an experience out there that facilitates having to feel and deal with what is in us. The solitude, the lack of distractions that at times the social context, our social context can provide us. Of course, connection is vital and essential for human well-being. And it can be balanced with the idea of developing a sense of yourself, and solitude can provide that. And there is a focus and an increase in intensity in the wilderness with our feelings and connecting to what's going on. And of course, there's a group and a social component where they're learning to feel. I use the example all the time that it starts with this simple idea that somebody will say something sarcastic or offhanded in a group, and we'll ask them what's going on for them. And their first response is almost always nothing. I didn't mean anything by it. And then we spend the next 20, 30, 40 minutes talking about it until they learn to follow that back to what was going on for them. The 4 tasks of the grieving process is to accept the reality of the loss. And that's a hard piece because that asks one to experience a lot of pain. And then, of course, to allow oneself to feel the pain of grief. And that can be many, many days, weeks, months, even years of tears. Learning to adjust to an environment in which the attachment is missing. The environment is not the same. And somebody said it to me this way when they lost a spouse of many, many years, that she came to terms with the fact that it was important for her to think about it for her children, her adult children, their families, that some things were going to be the same and some things were going to be different. That's what she would tell herself coming up to the holidays or family visits, to acknowledge that both of these things were true. And then withdraw some emotional energy and reinvest it in other attachments in life, the people that are still living. And understanding that that's a difficult process because sometimes the moving on to these new attachments feels like a dishonoring of the person. And so that's, again, an area where the person needs to go on in their own speed. And I want to tell you, this is not just with death. This is with any loss, any transition. As silly as it sounds, and some of you might not like this celebrity, this sports celebrity, but I was writing on my social media and talking to friends last week when Kobe Bryant retired. And I had a lot of grief about it. And people would say to me, well, I don't like Kobe Bryant. I said, it's not about Kobe Bryant. It's about the last 20 years of my life, my children, my 21-year-old daughter couldn't watch it because it represented her childhood and watching the games together and going to games and getting the jerseys for Father's Day and for her birthday and all those things. And so as simple, as trite as that might sound, it was a real loss. It was my children's childhood, my young parenthood, my college years. There was a lot of things that went into that. So it's important to understand that it happens for all of us. and for a lot of the different things, and it's not just for the big things. And we all get to decide what we're grieving. Nobody gets to tell us. So what is the primary goal of grief therapy? Simply put, is to increase the reality of the loss and all that comes along with it. And when said that way, we have a very different idea about what therapy is. We stop thinking about it as something that makes us feel better, and we start realizing that it's something that just makes us feel. Like I talk about in my book with my own evolution as a therapist. Sometimes we ask people to write or simply just talk about the events of the loss. A lot of times it's talking about it over and over again. And again, for some people and families, they don't have that need. And that's why having a professional work with you or your children can be helpful. Because I can sit there and listen because I've not experienced the same grief. I've experienced some grief and some loss, but not your particular grief and loss. But I can feel it, and it can bring me to powerful emotions myself. Identify and express the emotions. Identify and express the thinking or the rational thoughts, all that goes into it. I'll never be happy. Things can never be okay. Those kinds of thoughts. I think one of the things we do with our program is, and you can do in your families, is think about it. I think about this all the time, that one of the great values of behavioral interventions, the behavioral part of the interventions that we talk about at Evoke and that you might talk about or consider at home, is that you're really blocking the escape routes. Right? You're putting up a barrier, so it's kind of like, I think of it as a funnel back to more authentic, pure, and fundamental sadness and pain and grief. And so blocking escapes is a way that I assign value to behavioral interventions and our program. And then, of course, learning to train each of us, and this goes with all of our therapy, with all our feelings, learning to connect our symptoms to our grief. And we do that in a lot of things. With substance abuse therapy, they've been talking, I've learned about this 30 years ago, 35 years ago, that if we can connect our symptoms to our pain, to our sadness, to our fear, to our hurt, they cease to become effective at distracting and numbing us. Right? If we can attach the substance abuse in one's life to the pain, the anxiety, the shame, whatever it is that it's covering up, then it ceases to be effective for them and distracting them. So the way that we think about it with our staff and with our field instructors is, of course, it's time. There's time here to grieve. Absolutely, and I've said this many, many times on the webinar already tonight, allow for individual differences. For those of you who have experienced grief, you know that to be patronized and offered platitudes is not helpful. Right? You know that. And that applies to the grief of your child missing their prom. Things aren't the way they were supposed to be, the way that you had planned. And when people try to tell you to look on the bright side, but yeah, this is a great gift that you're giving to him, they're expressing their inability to sit with your feelings and your grief. I love this idea in therapy, and I think about it in lots of aspects of therapy, and it's the decision that we make as therapists is, does this person need a glue or a solvent? Right? And so sometimes you're helping provide resources to help the person manage it, and sometimes you're providing tools, interventions to help them feel it because they're holding it too tight together to be able to move through it. So you can be offering support and resources and ideas, or you can be asking them to go more deeply, more profoundly, more authentically into their suffering. Talk about the idea of letting go not being a dishonoring of the loss, but a natural part of the process. Right? That things will, parents will say all the time to us, I want it to be the way that it was. It'll never be the way that it was. It'll be different. It's going to be a different life. And the profound the grief, the loss, the more profound and systemic will be the difference. And so we can't go back, and that's part of the loss, is that it won't be the same. I know I don't want to share trite ones to minimize the pain that some of you are going through or have gone through, but I think it illustrates how simple it can be. I told the story a few weeks ago. I was flying over my high school in an airplane. I could see it. And I remember the sadness that I felt. And I would not want to go back to high school for all the money in the world. But there was still a loss. It was still a part of my childhood. Avoid the flight to health. Flight to health is a phrase that we talk about in therapy where the person wants to be cured and cured fast. And look, I'm all over it. And it's important to slow down that process because speeding through that will most likely skip essential pieces, essential steps in the process. Only people who avoid love can avoid grief. The point is to learn from it and remain vulnerable to love. And we talked about this in the intensive that we had just this last week with the participants. If you try to pull down somebody's wall, the wall that they have built to protect them, imagine that you walk up to a child and you try to pull down the wall. And how do we do that? We point it out. We say it's their defenses. We tell them that they're just trying not to feel, right? We call them on their crap. We focus on the symptoms instead of the recognition of the wound. If you just go and try to pull the wall down, what is that person going to do? They're going to reinforce the wall and build it higher. But if we can honor it, right? If we can honor the defense and recognize how it served them, and even express gratitude toward it, understanding and compassion and empathy for it, they then can experience the emotional safety in that relationship to take the risk of pulling it down. So to just tell somebody they have to get over it or move through it doesn't work. We have to honor their patience and their process by developing a greater capacity. I just drew this because I remember this was from an addiction packet I'd read over 20 years ago for the first time. It was just a little page out of an addiction packet. And it was just, I think it's just a simple illustration of the way that we do therapy, the way that we go through pain and grief. And I drew that myself, but it was almost exactly like that from the Hazelden group. And it just simply illustrates that there's a loss and that we either move through the pain and grief or we try to get around it, try to go under it, try to ignore it, try to resist it, right? Instead of learning to feel it, learning to embrace it as painful as it is, learning to recognize that it's what we need to move on and to be whole and to integrate. And on the other side of it will be something greater, something different. Resiliency comes from knowing that we can go through difficult things and having a connection that can see and hear us. What we do in this process is that we ask our clients to be accountable for their symptoms so that they can begin to learn how to feel their feelings. Right? We have accountability so that they can be responsible for the way that they manifest their pain and their grief. And of course, compassion and empathy are the two most important ingredients. I want to honor your grief. I have tried for years not to talk parents out of it or give them platitudes when they're experiencing grief. The grief of your child being away from home, of normal life, that it'll never be normal again. That you're missing typical and normal markers that happen during a parent-child relationship and during a childhood. The loss of what is normal is an important piece to let go of. Now, do I have a tremendous amount of faith and experience that the parents and children who go through our process end up with something beautiful and wonderful in many, many cases? Absolutely. But you've also lost something. The loss of a child is the most difficult thing that it is said that a parent can go through. And I've known people who have had that and known people who have gone through that recently. And the amount of symptoms, divorce, depression, substance abuse, and addiction that come after the loss of a child are off the charts. It's considered, according to the social stressor scale and the research associated with it, to be the hardest thing that a human being has to go through. And if you've lost one, you know that already. But even the loss or the transition of a child out of the home can be a part of that. And sometimes we're losing a part of our parenthood. I remember when one of my children moved away, my second oldest child. I've kind of two older children and two younger children. I remember thinking that that was the end of an era of parenthood for me. And it was, I wept and sobbed for days and days and days after that. And then there's those typical rites of passage, like I discussed, that we lose in this process. So honor yourselves, get help, recognize that you're going to grieve differently. Don't have your version of grief and loss and pain be the truth for somebody else. Don't be around people that tell you how to grieve or tell you their version of it is the right way and yours is the wrong way. Find people who can contain it, sit with it, embrace it, and help you move through it instead of resist it. Instead of, like I said, being in a battle with yourself and with the universe and with what is. In Christianity and Judaism and Islam, it's called faith. In Buddhism, it's called radical acceptance. In Taoism, it's called the way, right? It's all the same thing, which is, this is what it is. This is life. Death is inevitable if we are going to love. Loss is inevitable if we are going to love. And if we have a process where we can move through it, then we can also appreciate and enjoy all of the treasures that love and connection have to offer. Escapes are things like what your children were doing at home, numbing out, playing video games, drugs and alcohol. So by sending them to Evoke, in a sense, you've blocked their escapes. When you have rules and boundaries in your home, you're essentially setting up brick walls that redirect the child to some other process. I remember one time when I was confronting one of my children's symptoms of acting out, I said, the consequences is we're going to talk about it. That's your consequence. We're going to talk about it. Not going to be a lecture or a big punishment on this one, but I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to share things. It's going to be awkward and uncomfortable, and it's going to be difficult, but that's kind of what we do. And it's not like we solved everything, but by setting up barriers that make it difficult for them to escape, you're redirecting them, asking them, inviting them into a place of feeling. And then, of course, there's a lot of skills around that we can develop. And Evoke is essentially a block, a barrier that you've put up. I've really been grieving lately about the loss of normalcy with my son, who is now in an RTC. Do you think this will pop up throughout my life? I know that I will move through it, but will I always grieve this loss? I think he's feeling it too. I found that it comes in waves. I will just share this for myself. When I think about the loss of normalcy of some of the things that went on in my life with my son or in my own life, I don't grieve it anymore. I'm actually grateful for it. There's a line out of the book, The Letters of Juliet to the Knight in Rusty Armor, where she says, I became thankful and grateful that all of our dreams did not work out. And I think that can be a transformation. And so, while some things like the loss of a child, it's a wound from which we never fully recover, we just integrate. The loss of normalcy, I have found in my life and in watching my clients, that they come to appreciate the differences more than they ever would have had the normalcy. I tell the story often, I've told it many times, where a mother at graduation was describing a recent football activity that she went to with her son. Her son wasn't there because he was with us, but she was with all the other parents. And it was this big ceremony honoring mothers, and it was the last football game of the year. And she came, and I was ready to validate the grief and the loss, and she said, I felt so sorry for all the other mothers, that they weren't experiencing what I was with my son in our letters, our phone calls, and our visits. And so, fairly early on in the process, she experienced that. So my experience is, many people get to that place. I wouldn't try to talk you into it, but that's my experience. I'm so glad that I've had the struggles that I've had. And yes, there has been grief with some of those, but man, I would never know what I know without the pain, the grief, the struggles, the losses that I've had. I would never feel as rich spiritually, emotionally, psychologically as I feel, and the gratitude that I have for my life because of all those losses and the things that I've learned and the things that I've gained from it. I can't express enough. So that's my own experience. How do you help people to understand that you are still grieving that your child has been gone? You thought it was just a few months at Evoke, and now it is possibly 12 months in aftercare. And they just want to get over it. Or sometimes your therapist, even sometimes your therapist. I think talking about it, I feel pretty passionate about that last part because I think it's true. And if your therapist does that or is suggesting it, you just say, sometimes I think you're impatient with me. Sometimes I think you need me to get over it. And that's not my need right now. So, and if you have a good therapist, they will listen to you and take a step back and apologize and recommit to seeing there and being there for you and not needing you to show up in any way. I think talking about it, advocating for yourself. If there are people in your life that continuing to want to talk you out of it, to need you to be over it, I think it's okay to put some distance between you and them for a while until you go through your process. So taking care of yourself, asking people to take care of you and support you if they can in the ways that you need is totally appropriate. And if they can't, then it's okay to take space. I've said to family members sometimes, if you can't sit with it, go somewhere else. And if they can't sit with you, call a therapist. Get in touch with somebody you can. And some therapists, you're right, they have no capacity to sit with it. They want to make it okay. They want to go quick to problem solving. And I would just get a new therapist. I'd confront them first, tell them, give them a chance to respond in a helpful way. But if they can't respond in a helpful way, get a new therapist who doesn't need you to show up in any way for them to feel okay or to be at peace or to feel successful or to feel effective. All of those have nothing to do with your needs. That doesn't mean we can't gently ask questions and invite you to feel more, to move through it. But if I need to do it for me, it's not therapy. You shouldn't be paying me then. You're welcome. All right. Let's go over a few of the upcoming events. Here's the upcoming workshop. We'd like all current parents to go there if possible. People rave about them. The next Finding You is not until June. So we just finished one in April, and next month is already full. The Heroic Journeys is a family one, and the Finding You is an individual one. So get on board with those. Those are very deep 4-day intensives. 5, 6, 7 people that do really powerful and personal work, very emotional. I'm going to make a trip to New York in May, so I'm going to make a trip down to Philadelphia. Also going to do something in Northern California in May. Here are the upcoming ones that are scheduled. I'll be in Chicago on Wednesday. Jesse Ingdahl at the Visions Treatment Center, who's co-run many of them, will be in Southern California at the same time. And then Gregory Koufakos, who many of you have had the pleasure of working with, will be running one in New York City there on April 24th. Contact Stephanie at evoketherapy.com to RSVP. Pursuits are our family and young adult adventure trips. Light, therapy light, more about sober fun, connection, communication, and experiencing it. We want all family members to attend 6 of these while their children are with us. Don't wait until you go along. Stay connected to us with us on social media so you can look for inspirational stories, pictures, quotes, and announcements. The book is on paperback and also available on Audible and CD for purchase. If you go to our Parent Alumni Foundation book page, you can buy books there, and a percentage of that goes toward the charity to help people afford therapy that can't afford it otherwise. All right, Stephanie, any more questions before I close up? Now that my son is in an RTC after wilderness, it seems to be harder. I miss wilderness and the therapy he was receiving. I'm glad that you said that. I didn't even talk about that. But people grieve the wilderness process. The support, the intimacy of it, the progress, the dynamics of it. And RTCs are harder. Therapeutic schools are harder sometimes because it's more like regular life without as much support. And that can be difficult. It's one of the reasons why we provide these webinars for life, is to keep you connected to it if you want to use it as a resource. But that's a very, very common kind of experience for parents. In fact, when I talk about aftercare and transitioning to aftercare, I prepare parents for that because it's very, very normal. So thank you. And thanks for correcting the spellings, Stephanie. My son is 19 and anxious, anticipating the loss of his grandfather, who is currently 9 to 5, and his dog, who is 14. This comes up frequently. The only thing I can say is I'm sorry. and be there for him if you can, and don't try to talk him out of it. And those are both pretty good ripe ages to get to for a human being and for a dog, but it's not something you say to somebody. And it's okay to feel what he feels. It's an important thing in our families that we're allowed to feel what we feel, and that we don't need to feel something different so our parents are okay. If our children need to feel something, even at the intensive, we had this experience where one of the parents came to the realization that she wanted her child to feel something that she thought he needed to feel so that she would be okay, so that it was a reality for her. And that was a powerful realization. So it's important that we develop enough capacity, enough bandwidth, that we don't require others to feel what we need them to feel. And that we get that need taken care of with our therapists, with our mentors, at our 12-step meetings, at our support groups. Can you address the loss a girl feels after rape, and how, as a parent, I can support this very unusual grief she must be experiencing? Does that make sense? Yeah, I think it's important that we get support as parents, because I think we go through something in a trauma like that is our own and is something different than theirs, and where we become tempted to try to talk them out of it. And a therapist who's doing his or her job can maintain that containment more easily, if you will. So that's another one where make sure everybody in the family gets the triage that they need, because they can't do it for each other. They love each other the most, but they're not most capable at that time. So that's important. Do your piece. There's a book that we ask children to read, or young people to read, called The Loss of Innocence, right? There's this loss of innocence, loss of childhood, right? This loss of a sense of safety, loss of a control over one's own body, right? Loss of feeling safe and secure. All of those things are real. And so you just identify them, you ask them to talk about them, over and over and over again. You honor them, you hold them gently, you give tools to the parents so that they can do it too, making sure the parent is getting what they need in the process. And they get to the place of empowerment, they get to the place of strength, they get to the place of non-shame in it as you do all of that. But if you try to take them to those places too quickly, too early, you dishonor their grief and loss process. And that's a perfect example of where all of us would want them to get to the non-shame place as soon as possible, and the feeling of wholeness and safety as soon as possible. That seems like it's a loving effort or want on our part, absolutely. So I think that's really a great question. Thank you so much for your questions, for your participation. And I'm working on Thursday night. I'm trying to get an earlier flight back on Thursday so I can do the webinar Thursday night. If not, I might have to push it to Monday. So the date and time is not set yet, but I'll get you the date and time as soon as possible. And we're going to talk about understanding addiction versus experimentation, and a little bit about our approaches to treat it at Evoke Therapy Programs. Have a great evening. Hope these are helpful points of contact. My heart is with you in all of your grief. I know it personally as a father, and I can sit with it. So have a great evening, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.